I never told my daughter's ex-boyfriend that I spent 30 years hunting the worst monsters on Earth as a United States Marshal. To him, I was just a frail 70-year-old man who drove a beat-up, battered 2000 Chevy pickup. He threatened my family. He told me he would ruin my daughter and burn my house to the ground if she ever tried to leave him. She left anyway. And when he showed up at my property in the dead of night with his hired muscle, well, my wife and I were already out on the porch waiting for him. The text from Cora came in at exactly 2 in the afternoon. 3 words, nothing more. "Dad, please hurry." I didn't call her back. When a message like that lands from your child, you don't stop to ask questions. You just move. I grabbed my keys, headed out to the driveway, and got into my battered 2000 Chevy pickup. Welcome to His Hidden Revenge, the place where the stories that don't make headlines finally get told. If this is your first time here, tap that subscribe button so the next story finds its way to you without you having to go looking. Before we get into it, I'm curious where you're listening from right now. Is it morning with your coffee, a quiet afternoon, or late at night when the house has finally gone still? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing who's out there. Now, a quick note, some details in this story have been dramatized for the purpose of telling it well. Any resemblance to specific real persons or events is entirely coincidental. But the truth at the heart of it, that part is very real. The engine coughed and sputtered before catching a sound I'd long since made my peace with. I pushed hard on that drive into downtown Charlotte, coaxing everything the old truck had. Gavin Driscoll lived in one of those gleaming glass and steel luxury high-rises right in the heart of the city. The kind of building where doormen wear tailored suits and look at you like you've tracked something in on their marble floors. I pulled my truck straight into the loading zone and left it there, ignoring the valet's frantic hand signals. I let my limp show as I crossed the lobby, rounding my shoulders forward, making myself look a shade smaller and older than I am. It is remarkable what people fail to see when they've already decided you're just a feeble old man. I rode the elevator to the penthouse level. When the doors parted, the extravagance of that hallway hit me all at once, but I had no use for it. I found Gavin's door sitting slightly ajar. I nudged it open and went inside. The apartment was immaculate and cold, the kind of sterile that costs a fortune, but the living room was chaos. Cora was frantically stuffing clothes into a worn nylon duffel bag, her hands trembling so badly she could hardly get the zipper to catch. She looked up when I walked in, and the raw panic in my little girl's eyes hit me square in the chest. She looked wrung out, frightened, and small. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "We have to go before he gets back from his meeting." I nodded slowly, playing the part, the hesitant, dawdling father. I shuffled over and lifted the bag from her hands, letting my arms tremble just enough to sell it. "Let's go, sweetheart," I said quietly. We moved out of the apartment and into the elevator. Cora watched the floor numbers count down, holding her breath the entire way. I rested a hand on her shoulder to steady her, but my mind had already moved on. I was running the exits, tracing the sight lines, measuring the distance back to the truck. The elevator chimed and the doors opened onto the ground floor lobby, and there he was. Gavin Driscoll was planted squarely in our path, slim leather portfolio case in hand, wearing a custom-tailored suit that likely cost more than my truck was worth. He was 35, arrogant, and moved with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his whole life buying his way clear of consequences. His eyes dropped to Cora's bag, and his smug look curdled into something uglier. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice thick with condescension. Cora went rigid. She stepped behind me without thinking, putting my body between herself and him. Gavin let out a short, mean laugh. He came toward us at a leisurely pace, his expensive shoes cracking sharply against the marble. He pulled up a few feet away and looked me over with open contempt. He didn't register a threat. What he saw was an old man in a denim work shirt clutching a beat-up duffel bag. Gavin stepped past me and seized Cora's arm. "You're not going anywhere," he snapped, tightening his fingers around her wrist. She tried to pull free, but he yanked her back hard. I moved forward, hands trembling on purpose, and laid my fingers lightly on his wrist. "Please, son," I said, pitching my voice into a perfect frightened old man quaver. "Let her go. We don't want any trouble." Gavin threw my hand off hard enough to send me back a step. "You don't want any trouble, old man?" he sneered. "You walked into my lobby trying to steal my girlfriend. If she goes through those doors, I'm going to freeze every cent she has. I'll drown you both in legal bills until you have to sell that heap you drove here and eat off the pavement." He swung his attention back to Cora. "Get back upstairs, now." I kept my chin-down eyes on the marble. I let my shoulders cave. I gave him the slow, submissive nod of a man broken by wealth and aggression. "I'm sorry, son," I mumbled. "Just let her collect her things. We'll be out of your way." Gavin smiled that sickening, victorious smile. He released Cora's arm, feeling every inch the king. He had dominated the frightened old father and the cowering girlfriend. The moment he turned his back to bark something at the valet, I quietly steered Cora through the revolving doors and directly into the passenger seat of the truck. I slung the bag into the bed, got behind the wheel, and dropped it into gear. Gavin was shouting something from the lobby doors, but we were already clear of the curb. Threading through downtown Charlotte traffic, Cora finally came apart. She pressed her face into her hands and sobbed. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she cried. "He froze our joint accounts this morning. He kept the keys to my car. He said if I tried to leave, he'd destroy my life. I have nothing left." I let her cry, keeping my eyes steady on the road. I drove smooth, and even folding us into the afternoon traffic. No yelling, no cursing Gavin's name. I simply took stock of the situation. I checked the rearview mirror. A black SUV with heavy tinted glass had rolled out of a parking garage 2 blocks back and was holding my speed to the mile. When I drifted lanes, it drifted. When I eased off for a yellow, it eased off too. Gavin had put a tail on us. Cora was still talking through her tears, laying out the financial abuse she'd endured over the past 6 months. I was half absorbing her words. The other half of my mind was doing what it had done for 30 years. I was tracking the predator in the mirror. Without tipping off my daughter, I cut a sharp right down a narrow industrial side street. The black SUV made the turn, but hung well back, trying to stay invisible. I didn't touch the accelerator. Speeding up is till it announces that you've made them. Instead, I held a perfectly ordinary pace threading through a tangle of back roads, delivery alleys, and tight neighborhood streets. Pure muscle memory from a career's worth of field work. Blind corners timed, lights routes that close behind you. I cut left through a busy strip mall lot, let a delivery truck seal off the main exit, and slipped out through the service road in the back. 10 minutes later, the black SUV had evaporated into the suburban sprawl. Cora never knew we'd had company. We left downtown behind and headed out toward the wooded property Lenora and I kept in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina. That shift from concrete to towering pines always settles something in me. We came up the long gravel drive and parked near the house. Lenora was out on the porch waiting. She didn't need an explanation. One look at Cora's tear-streaked face, and she was down the steps and had her arms around our daughter. My wife is a sharp, perceptive woman. She built her career as a federal prosecutor, and she knows exactly how to hold a crisis steady. Lenora guided Cora gently inside, leaving me alone in the quiet of the porch. I was about to follow them in when Cora's phone buzzed from inside the worn nylon duffel bag I was still carrying. I unzipped it, fished out the phone, and looked at the screen. Gavin. I swiped to answer and held it to my ear without a word. "You think you're smart?" Gavin's voice punched through the speaker, loaded with arrogance. "You think you can just drive off and stash her somewhere I know where you live? I know exactly where that little cabin in the woods is. You put her in a car and send her back right now, or I'm sending my guys to your property to drag her out themselves. And if you get in the way, I'll make sure you spend your retirement digging through dumpsters." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue back. I simply breathed and listened while he burned through his rant. When he finally ran out of air, assuming silence on my end meant he'd won, I pressed the end call button and slipped the phone into my pocket. I stood there looking out at the tree line ringing the property as the night came down fast over the woods. Lenora had cooked a warm dinner and settled Cora into the guest room. The house had gone quiet, but every instinct I had was alive and running. Around midnight, I was seated in the darkened living room, watching the front window, the stillness of the forest cracked gravel shifting at the far end of my long driveway. No headlights, but the moonlight caught the shape of that same black SUV from the afternoon. It sat there idling heavy and threatening in the dark. Then a man climbed out of the passenger side. He came up the driveway toward the house at a steady walk. I didn't move. I stayed in the shadows and tracked every step. He stopped on the lawn, drew his arm back, and threw something hard. The rock punched through the living room window, spraying glass across the wooden floor. The man turned and trotted back to the SUV, and it disappeared into the dark. I didn't flinch when the glass went. I got up, calmly crossed to the shattered window, and picked the stone up off the floorboards. Wrapped tight around it with electrical tape was a folded piece of white paper. I peeled the tape free and opened the note in the thin moonlight. The words were written in thick black marker. "Send her back, or the house burns." I held those words in my gaze for a long moment. Then I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. Gavin Driscoll thought he was putting the fear of God into a helpless old man. He thought he was playing a game he'd already sewn up. He had no idea he had just stepped into the sights of someone who spent his entire career hunting men far more dangerous than him. I stood on the porch, fragments of window glass crunching softly under my boots. That rock, with its crude, threatening note still wrapped around it, sat heavy in my pocket. "Send her back or the house burns." I looked out into the dark wall of trees surrounding the property. To anyone else, that darkness reads as empty. But I knew better. I understood exactly what men like Gavin Driscoll were capable of, the particular brand of arrogance that convinces them they can do anything without facing a reckoning. He thought he was looking at a frightened old man. He thought every card in the deck was his. He had no idea what he'd just woken up. I didn't call the police. That was the first rule of the world I'd walked away from. When the threat is real and immediate, when your family's safety hangs in the balance, you don't wait on a dispatcher. You handle it yourself. I went back inside, checked that Cora was still asleep. She was exhausted, curled in the guest room, finally holding on to some fragile peace after the terror of the afternoon. Lenora met me in the hallway, her face giving nothing away. She saw the broken window. She saw the paper in my hand. She didn't ask questions. She didn't come apart. She just looked at me in a way that said, "Everything do what needs doing." I stepped out the back and walked through the damp grass toward the barn. The air was cold and sharp, carrying pine and wet earth, familiar and steadying. The barn had always been my sanctuary tools, old memories, the smell of timber and oil. But underneath all of that, it held things I hadn't laid hands on in years. I shoved aside a heavy wooden workbench, the effort pulling at a deep ache in my shoulder, a souvenir from a life spent in the dark. Behind it, out of sight, sat a solid steel safe. I dialed the combination, the steady click of each number, a sound I found oddly comforting. The door swung open. There, resting on a square of velvet cloth, was my badge. United States Marshal. It was not just a piece of stamped metal. It stood for decades of hunting the most dangerous men alive, men who believed they were beyond reach, men exactly like Gavin Driscoll. Next to the badge lay the gear tactical vest, specialized communications equipment, surveillance hardware that had tracked fugitives across international borders. I hadn't touched any of it since I retired, hoping that particular chapter had closed for good. Some chapters won't stay shut. I lifted out the small, unassuming black cases. These were nothing like standard security cameras. They were military-grade, designed to be completely invisible, capable of pulling high-resolution images and video in total darkness. I spent the next 3 hours working the perimeter of my property with methodical care. I moved the way I always had in the field, quiet, deliberate, already thinking 2 steps ahead of whoever was coming. I positioned the cameras to cover every approach, every blind spot, every angle that left us exposed. I tucked them into the hollows of old oaks and buried them in the underbrush, their lenses locked onto the driveway, the woodline, and the main road. The memories came back as I worked the adrenaline, the sharpened focus, the cold precision that had kept me breathing for 30 years. I was no longer Dale Corbett, the retired grandfather. I was the operative who had taken apart cartels and tracked ghosts through the most hostile terrain on Earth. My target now was a spoiled, arrogant real estate developer who had made the fatal mistake of threatening my daughter. I finished the last camera as the first gray light of dawn started bleeding into the eastern sky. I stood at the property line, looking out over the quiet stretch of trees. The trap was set, every approach covered. Gavin Driscoll thought he was the predator in this situation. He thought intimidation and money were all it took to get what he wanted. But he had just walked into a carefully built cage, and the jaws were ready to close. I made my way back to the house, the cold morning air biting against the heat building inside me. Lenora was already up pouring coffee at the counter. She looked over when I came in, her eyes carrying concern, and something unshakable behind it. "Perimeter's secure," I said quietly, taking the heavy stoneware coffee mug she held out. She nodded. She understood the full weight of those 2 words. The situation had shifted. Gavin Driscoll was no longer dealing with a frightened old man. He was dealing with a phantom, a figure from a world he couldn't begin to imagine. And sitting there, sipping my coffee, watching the sun inch up over the treetops, I knew with complete certainty that he was going to regret ever crossing into my life. The pivot had been made. The hunt was on. The morning sun had barely cleared the tall pines ringing the property when a heavy fist hammered the front door, the sound rolling through the whole house. Cora startled and knocked her coffee across the kitchen table. The fear that jumped into her eyes was immediate and total. Lenora laid a calm, steady hand over our daughter's shaking fingers while I walked unhurried toward the front of the house. I didn't stop to check the perimeter cameras first. I already knew what this was. Arrogant men who operate behind walls of money are entirely predictable in their next move. When physical intimidation doesn't break you, they pick up the law like a club. I pulled open the front door to find a young county deputy on the porch, visibly ill at ease, shifting his weight and clutching a thick stack of manila folders. He asked for Cora Corbett. I stepped back and called her over. When he pressed the heavy stack into her hands and told her she'd been officially served, the color left her face entirely. She took the folders with trembling hands and backed away as the deputy turned and walked to his cruiser, without another word. Cora carried the pile of legal papers to the kitchen table. She opened the top folder and started to read. I watched her eyes move across the dense legal language, and within moments her breathing went shallow and quick. A small broken sob came out of her before she dropped the pages like they'd burned her. She folded into a kitchen chair, arms wrapped around herself. "Dad," she whispered the word, barely making it out intact. "He's suing me. He's saying I stole from his company." I gathered the documents off the floor and worked through the first few pages. Gavin Driscoll was formally accusing my daughter of embezzling $75,000 from his luxury real estate development company. The paperwork was thorough and vicious. Fabricated ledger entries, doctored bank statements, aggressive legal demands. It called for immediate restitution and threatened criminal charges. It was signed by a local civil judge named Quinlan. I knew that name. Judge Quinlan had a well-established reputation in the county for being exceptionally accommodating to wealthy developers who quietly bankrolled his re-election campaigns. Gavin hadn't simply hired a ruthless attorney, he'd effectively purchased a judge. "He's going to send me to federal prison." Cora cried, her face buried in her hands. She was hyperventilating, the sheer size of the threat crushing the air right out of her. "He told me he'd do this. He said he'd make it look like I was the one moving money through his accounts. I never touched a single cent of his company's funds. I swear it, I never did. But he has all these official documents. He has the judge. They're going to lock me up and destroy my life." Lenora crossed the room and pulled our daughter in close, holding her steady, murmuring quiet reassurances and stroking her hair. But I didn't move. I didn't offer hollow promises. I didn't panic. I stood there staring at the ink on those pages. Gavin believed he had just played the perfect hand. He thought he had us cornered in the dark, with nothing left but surrender. Right on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the lit screen. Unknown number, but I knew exactly who was behind it. The message read, "I told you I would ruin her, old man. Send her back to me right now and the lawsuit disappears. Keep playing games and she will spend the next 10 years in a tiny federal cell." I held the glowing screen in my gaze for a long moment. A normal father would have come apart. A normal father would have been on the phone to the local police, or worse, would have started weighing whether giving in was the only way to protect his child from a prison sentence. But I was not a normal father. I had spent 30 years dismantling international criminal enterprises. I had sat across steel interrogation tables from cartel bosses who made Gavin Driscoll look like an angry child throwing a fit in a sandbox. I slid the phone back into my pocket and crossed to the kitchen table. I pulled out a chair and sat directly across from my trembling daughter. I reached out and wrapped my rough hands around hers, drawing them gently away from her tear-streaked face. "Cora!" I said, my voice low, even, and completely steady. "I need you to look at me right now." She blinked hard, fighting through the tears, her chest still heaving. She found my eyes, and I made sure what she saw in them was nothing but cold, absolute certainty. "You are not going to prison," I told her. "You are not going to a courtroom. You are not going to hand this man a single dime, and you are never going back to him." "But the papers!" She sobbed, one hand gesturing weakly a heavy stack of folders on the table. "He has the judge. He has unlimited money. He has everything." I picked up the stack of legal documents and felt the weight of them. To a frightened civilian, this looked like a death sentence already signed and sealed. To a man who understood how the justice system actually operated from the inside, it was nothing but a pile of cheap paper and paper burns. "Gavin thinks he's fighting a war with money and lawsuits," I said, keeping my voice measured and level. He thinks buying a local judge means he controls the whole board. What Gavin doesn't understand is that when you fabricate financial crimes to frame an innocent person, you leave a paper trail. You leave digital fingerprints behind. He thinks he's using the law as an ironclad shield. What he's actually done is hand us the exact weapon we need to take his entire life apart. Cora looked at me, the raw panic in her face slowly giving way to something confused and uncertain. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she asked, dragging a hand across her cheek. "How do we fight a millionaire who already has a corrupt judge in his corner? We can't even afford to hire a lawyer to look at this." I gave her a thin, quiet smile. I let go of her hands, stood up, and took the fraudulent lawsuit off the table with me. Lenora, who had spent her whole career as a relentless federal prosecutor, caught my eye from across the room. She gave me one small, deliberate nod. She had already spotted the fatal flaw buried in Gavin's arrogant play. When you submit falsified financial records to a court, you are committing perjury and fraud at the federal level. Gavin had just put his own crimes down on paper and delivered them straight to a retired United States Marshal. "Don't worry about the paperwork, sweetheart," I said, turning toward the hallway. "I know people who read this kind of garbage for sport. You stay here with your mother, drink your coffee, try to rest. I have a phone call to make." As I moved down the quiet hall, I felt that familiar cold focus settle in, the kind that used to come over me before a long operation. Gavin Driscoll had just crossed a line he couldn't come back from. By formally accusing my daughter of financial crimes, he had unknowingly swung the door wide open for a full federal inquiry into his own real estate company. He thought he was running a straightforward small-town intimidation play. He had no idea I was about to drag him into a federal arena where his money and his bought judge were worth absolutely nothing. He wanted to weaponize the law against my family. I was going to use his own towering arrogance to make sure he never breathed free air again. I walked into the small study at the back of the house and pulled the solid walnut door shut behind me. The room held the quiet smell of old paper and leather, a sanctuary where the relics of a former life still lived. I went to the bottom drawer of my desk, past the ordinary files, and pressed open a false panel in the base. Underneath lay a heavy encrypted satellite phone. I hadn't powered it on in 4 years, but the battery life on these government-issued devices was the stuff of legend. I hit the power button and watched the small green screen blink to life. It was time to call in a ghost. Warren Pelham was now a senior partner at one of the most aggressive corporate law firms in Atlanta. He billed by the minute and wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But 20 years ago, Warren was a terrified rookie federal prosecutor assigned to a cartel task force. He had made a careless mistake on a wiretap operation and accidentally exposed his own identity to a syndicate hit squad. They sent 3 men to his apartment in the middle of the night. I was the operative the marshals dispatched to intercept them. I sat in the dark of Warren's living room while he stayed hidden in a closet. When the front door splintered off its frame, I made sure those 3 men never moved again. Warren owed me his life and everything that came after it. He had told me to call any time I needed him, no matter what it cost. Today I was collecting on that. I dialed the secure sequence and waited. 2 rings, then a crisp professional voice picked up. "Warren Pelham speaking." "Warren," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "It's Dale Corbett." A long silence settled on the line. Through the receiver, I could make out the faint noise of Atlanta traffic, then the soft click of a door being closed. When Warren spoke again, the corporate Polish was completely gone in its place, the straightforward respect of a man who remembered exactly who he was talking to. "Dale," he said, exhaling slowly. "It's been a long time. Is everything all right? Are you and Lenora safe?" "We're safe," I told him. "But my daughter Cora has a problem. A local real estate developer named Gavin Driscoll just served her with a fabricated lawsuit accusing her of embezzling $75,000 from his company. He bought a local judge to rubber stamp the paperwork. He's trying to frighten her into coming back to him." "Tell me you have a copy of the filing," Warren said, his voice going hard with the protective instinct of an old friend. "Fax it to my secure line. I'll have a team of litigators tear it apart before lunch. We'll countersue for malicious prosecution and pile on so many injunctions he won't be able to draw a breath." "No," I said, settling back in my chair. "We're not going to fight the lawsuit, Warren. The lawsuit is a distraction, a loud noise meant to send us scrambling for cover. If we engage him in local civil court, we're playing by his rules on his ground. I don't play defense. We go straight for the throat. I heard Warren shift in his seat. What do you need me to do, Dale? Pull every corporate record, every tax filing, and every public ledger tied to Gavin Driscoll and his development company. I instructed. I want to see exactly where his money flows. I want to know his partners, his suppliers, where his capital originates. I want his entire financial life taken apart down to the last penny. Consider it done, Warren replied, fingers already moving across a keyboard. But if this guy is a local heavyweight, he almost certainly uses shell companies to hide his real assets. Public records will only give us the surface layer. We need a way behind the curtain. I'm working on that right now, I told him. You pull the public data and cross-reference it against his known assets. I'll get the shadow files. We reconvene in exactly 3 hours. I ended the call and set the phone on the desk. Warren was right. Public records were theater built to satisfy the IRS and local tax assessors, nothing more. To truly understand what Gavin Driscoll was hiding, I needed to see the money he was keeping out of sight. I needed a forensic accountant with federal clearance. I picked up the satellite phone again and dialed a different number. This one connected directly to a secure line inside the Treasury Department. The man who answered was an old task force analyst named Denton. He had spent his entire career chasing phantom funds for the government. Dale Corbett, you old hunting dog, Denton laughed through the receiver. I figured you were out on a porch somewhere whittling sticks. Taking a break from the porch, Denton, I said, keeping my tone flat and serious. I need a shadow check on a mid-level real estate developer operating in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina. Name is Gavin Driscoll. Denton stopped laughing on the spot. Rapid typing replaced the cheerfulness in his voice. Give me a second, Dale. You know I can't run off-book inquiries without a federal warrant. I know, I replied smoothly. But I also know you still owe me for pulling your brother out of that witness protection disaster in Tampa. Fair enough, Denton muttered. Give me the target's name again. I spelled out Gavin's full name and the registered title of his primary development company. I listened as Denton pulled up databases that don't officially exist, the surveillance networks the government runs to track terrorism financing and international smuggling operations. Aiming that kind of firepower at a local, arrogant developer was like using a sniper rifle to deal with a mosquito. But Gavin had brought it on himself. Ale, Denton said, his voice dropping to a serious whisper. I'm looking at the preliminary routing numbers on his corporate accounts. Something is extremely wrong here. Define wrong, I said, tightening my grip on the edge of the desk. He runs a luxury housing development firm, right? Denton said. But his capital isn't coming from domestic loans or standard real estate investors. He's pulling in massive wire transfers from offshore accounts routed through the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. They're breaking the deposits into smaller increments to dodge automatic flagging, but the volume is staggering. We're talking millions of dollars flooding into his company for properties that haven't broken ground yet. He's washing cash, I said, the realization clicking cleanly into place. He's running a commercial-scale laundering operation. Denton confirmed it. The money flows in from overseas. He books it as anonymous foreign investment capital for his building projects. Then it gets filtered out into clean domestic assets. Dale, this is not a local hustle. The routing numbers on these offshore accounts trace back to an Eastern European syndicate the FBI has been trying to nail for 5 years. Your boy Gavin is a glorified middleman, moving dirty money for some very dangerous people. A cold smile settled across my face. Gavin thought he was a king because he had a custom-tailored suit and a purchased judge, but he was nothing more than a highly expendable pawn for an international cartel. He didn't own his empire. He was just holding the keys for monsters he had no ability to control. I said, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. Keep monitoring those routing numbers. Don't flag them officially yet. Just gather the data. You got it, Dale, Denton replied. Watch yourself with this one. If he's holding the bag for a syndicate, he's desperate. Men like that will do anything to keep the money moving. I set down the phone and looked out the study window into the dense tree line. Gavin was desperate. That was why he had come apart when Cora left. That was why he was trying to terrorize her with a fabricated lawsuit. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was a liability. He had likely placed her name on some of those fraudulent accounts without her knowledge, making her the perfect fall guy if his operation ever unraveled. If she walked free, she could inadvertently expose his entire money laundering pipeline. Gavin thought he was running down a frightened girl and her fragile father. He had absolutely no idea that I had just mapped the full anatomy of his criminal life. He wanted to play a game of ruin. He was about to find out what real ruin looked like. Exactly 3 hours later, the encrypted satellite phone vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. I picked it up and pressed the green button. Warren didn't bother with greetings. He launched straight into the financial autopsy of Gavin Driscoll. "Dale, you were right," Warren said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Public records show a highly successful luxury real estate developer. But when my team dug into the subsidiary filings and cross-referenced them with corporate tax returns, the whole picture collapsed. Gavin's domestic company is bleeding cash. His high-end apartment buildings are essentially empty. He hasn't moved a legitimate unit in over 2 years. On paper, the man is completely bankrupt." I absorbed that carefully. "But the company is still running," I said. "He lives in a penthouse. He drives expensive cars. How is he staying afloat?" "That's it, star. Through a web of heavily layered shell companies," Warren explained. "He has 3 primary holding entities registered in Delaware. Those entities are receiving massive continuous cash injections from overseas, which he's classifying as anonymous foreign investments for future development projects. But the money only parks there for a few days before being transferred out into various domestic accounts under the guise of contractor payments and material costs. He's washing dirty money, Dale. Millions of it. I already had the overseas picture from Denton, but Warren had the corporate blueprints. What I needed now was the link to Cora. "Warren," I said, leaning toward the receiver, "Gavin is desperate to get Cora back. He's using a fabricated lawsuit to terrify her. Why? If he's running a massive laundering operation, the last thing he needs is to draw attention with a local civil suit. Why does she matter so much to him?" I heard paper rustling on Warren's end. He let out a long, heavy breath. "Because she's the fall guy. Dale," I pulled the incorporation documents for the primary holding company in Delaware, the one receiving the largest offshore deposits. "Gavin is not listed as the chief executive officer." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Cora is." "Explain that," I said, my voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He either forged her signature or he buried the incorporation papers inside a stack of routine documents and tricked her into signing them," Warren said. "Legally speaking, she is the primary beneficiary and the chief officer of the shell company holding the laundered funds. If the IRS or the federal government ever audits that company, Gavin walks away clean. Cora goes to federal prison for decades." The sheer malice of Gavin's scheme came into sharp focus. He hadn't just manipulated my daughter emotionally. He had systematically built her into a human shield for a violent criminal syndicate. The lawsuit, Warren continued, his words picking up pace. "It's not just about frightening her. It's a trap. He's accusing her of embezzling $75,000. If she panics and tries to settle out of court, she'll have to sign a settlement agreement. That agreement officially places her on the legal record acknowledging her connection to his corporate accounts. It binds her to the shell company permanently. But if she fights the lawsuit in court, discovery opens up his books. The authorities will see the offshore money, and the syndicate will find out Gavin exposed their laundering pipeline to a local court." I finished the thought. "Exactly," Warren said. "Gavin is trapped. If Cora talks to a lawyer or goes to the police, the syndicate will realize their money is at risk. Men who launder millions of dollars don't hire lawyers when their operation is threatened. They hire killers. Gavin knows his bosses will have him killed if this becomes public. He needs Cora back under his complete control to keep the shell company intact and the syndicate blind to his mistakes. He's a dead man walking," I said quietly, "and he's trying to drag my daughter into the grave with him. Dale," Warren said, his voice dropping with genuine concern, "this is no longer a domestic dispute or a fraudulent civil suit. You are dealing with cartel money. If Gavin panics and tells his handlers that Cora is a security risk, they won't just send local muscle to your property. They will send professionals. You need to get Cora out of the state. You need to put her in protective custody right now." I looked out the study window at the dense, silent woods wrapping around the property. I thought about the 30 years I had spent hunting men exactly like Gavin's bosses. I thought about the trail cameras I had just installed and the shotgun locked in the cabinet. Running was not an option. Running meant watching over our shoulders for whatever life we had left. When wolves are hunting you, you don't break for open ground. You draw them into a cage. We're not running Warren, I said. If we run, Gavin controls the story. He'll activate his corrupt judge, get a warrant issued for her arrest, and use the local police to do his hunting for him. We are staying right here. Then what's your play, Dale? Warren asked. I'm going to bleed him, I replied. Gavin is running on arrogance and fear. He thinks he can bully us into submission before his syndicate bosses notice his mistakes. We are going to expose those mistakes. I want you to draft a formal notification of a federal audit. Use every intimidating legal loophole you can find. I want you to legally freeze the assets in that Delaware shell company by the end of the day. Dale, if I freeze that account, the offshore deposits will bounce back, Warren cautioned. The syndicate will know instantly that something's off. They'll start demanding answers from Gavin. That is exactly what I want, I told him. I want Gavin to feel the leash drawing tight around his throat. I want him to understand that his money has vanished, that his power is nothing but smoke, and that his bosses are closing in. When a predator is starved and backed into a corner, he gets sloppy. He stops calculating and starts reacting on instinct. I want him rattled. I want him walking through my door. I ended the call before Warren could push back. I sat in the quiet study, letting the full weight of the situation press down on me. My daughter wasn't simply dealing with a dangerous ex. She was entangled with an international criminal operation. Gavin Driscoll believed he had constructed the perfect crime. He thought he could use a frail old man and a frightened woman as shields for his empire. He was about to receive a very hard education about the kind of men who actually move in the shadows. I rose from the desk and walked out of the study. It was time to begin pulling Gavin's life apart, thread by thread. We needed basic supplies to maintain the appearance of an ordinary routine. Lenora was working up a list of dry goods in the kitchen, and I offered to take Cora to the small local grocery store a few miles down from our property. It was a calculated risk, but my daughter needed to step outside to feel something close to normal after the terror of that morning. I drove the battered 2000 Chevy pickup, my eyes moving constantly between the mirrors. No black SUV was on our tail this time. Gavin was either sharpening his approach or growing desperate enough to shift tactics entirely. The grocery store was quiet, a drowsy little rural market with flickering fluorescent lights and narrow, close-set aisles. The air carried the scent of old floor wax and fresh citrus. Cora picked up a blue plastic shopping basket and moved at a measured pace toward the produce section. Her shoulders hadn't loosened. Her eyes flicked toward the automatic sliding doors every time they hissed apart. I kept a few paces back, giving her room to breathe while never letting her drift from my sight. I slipped away for just a moment to grab a bag of coffee beans one aisle over a brief, deliberate gap I created, so that Gavin would feel confident enough to move if he was watching us. I heard the sharp intake of breath before I even came around the corner. I eased silently to the edge of aisle 4 and looked down the narrow corridor. Gavin Driscoll had ambushed my daughter. He had managed to enter the store without being noticed, and now he was standing far too close to her, completely cutting off her path to the main checkout lanes. He wore a tailored cashmere overcoat that looked entirely out of place in that dusty little market. His face was twisted into a mask of ugly desperation and fury. "You think you can just ignore my calls?" he hissed, leaning directly into her space. "You think you can disappear into the woods with your pathetic parents, and I'll just let this lawsuit go?" Cora backed up until her shoulders hit the canned goods shelf. She looked absolutely terrified, clutching the blue plastic shopping basket against her chest like a fragile shield. "I told you I am done, Gavin." She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, just leave me alone." Gavin slammed his hand against the metal shelving right next to her head. A few cans rattled loose and dropped to the cold linoleum floor, rolling out toward the center of the aisle. "You do not tell me when we are done," he snarled, his voice vibrating with barely leashed violence. "You are coming back to downtown Charlotte with me right now. You are going to sign the settlement papers for the embezzlement lawsuit, and you are going to do exactly what I tell you. If you don't, I swear I will destroy your parents' retirement. I will take their house and leave them rotting in the street." I drew a slow breath and let my posture collapse entirely. I came up around the corner, shoulders caving, hands beginning to tremble with visible force. I deliberately clipped a box of cereal off a display stand, sending it clattering loudly to the floor to announce my arrival. Gavin's head snapped toward me, his eyes locking onto mine with pure contempt. "Please, son," I said, my voice high and unsteady. I moved forward, both hands raised in a gesture of complete surrender. "Please don't hurt my daughter. We don't want any trouble. Just let her walk away. We won't bother you again, I promise." Gavin let out a short, cruel laugh. He stepped away from Cora and moved slowly in my direction. The arrogance rolling off him was almost suffocating. His eyes swept over my faded denim work shirt, my stooped posture, my worn-out work boots. "You are a pathetic old man," he'd said, shaking his head. "I told you to send her back to me and you thought you could run games. Now you are both going to answer for it." I took another shuffling step forward, deliberately planting myself between him and my terrified daughter. I reached out a trembling hand and lightly touched the deep pocket of his tailored cashmere overcoat. "Please," I begged, letting real tears gather at the corners of my eyes. "I will do whatever you want. I will sign over my truck. I will hand you every cent I have saved. Just please don't take my little girl." Gavin's face twisted with absolute contempt. He looked down at my shaking hand resting against his expensive coat. "Don't touch me, you piece of trash," he snapped. He raised his arm and shoved me hard in the chest. I let my body go completely slack, no bracing, no reaching for balance. The full force of the push sent me backward, and I hit the cold linoleum floor hard. The impact cracked through the empty aisle. My elbow absorbed the worst of it, sending a genuine spikes of pain up my arm, but I pushed it aside. I lay there groaning softly, clutching my chest, as though the air had been driven clean out of me. "Dad!" Cora screamed, dropping her basket and rushing to my side. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pulling me close. She looked up at Gavin with pure hatred cutting through her terror. "You are a monster," she cried. Gavin stood over me, looking down at my sprawled figure on the dirty grocery store floor. He let out a loud, booming laugh that rang through the quiet market. "Look at your great protector, Cora," he mocked, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave. "This weak, pathetic old fool can't even stay on his feet. You think he can save you from me? You think he can stop what's coming? You are both nothing but dead weight." I let out another faint groan and squeezed my eyes shut as if the pain were overwhelming. Cora was sobbing, pleading with me to get up, but I stayed perfectly motionless on the floor, playing the defeated and helpless victim with absolute precision. Gavin straightened the lapels of his overcoat, every inch the conquering king. He had asserted his dominance physically, mentally. He had shown Cora that her father was nothing more than a fragile obstacle easily brushed aside by his wealth and his reach. "I'll give you until tonight to pack your bags and come back to the city," Gavin said, his voice laced with venom. "If I haven't heard from you by midnight, I'm activating the judge. I'm freezing your parents' accounts, and then I'm coming back to that cabin to finish this. Don't make me come back to the woods, Cora." With one final look of disgust aimed at me trembling on the floor, Gavin turned on his heel and strode confidently out of the aisle. We listened to his heavy footsteps echo toward the front doors and dissolve into the parking lot. Cora was still crying, gripping my shirt, begging to know I was all right. I slowly opened my eyes and looked up at my daughter. The trembling in my hands stopped cold. Every trace of fear drained from my face, replaced by the sharp, steady focus of a man who was simply doing his job. I sat up cleanly, knocking the dust from my denim work shirt. I was completely fine. Gavin believed he had just won the war, but he had no idea that his arrogance had handed me precisely what I needed to take him apart. I lay on the cold linoleum floor of that grocery aisle, releasing a long, unsteady breath. My elbows burned from the impact, and my shoulder ached, but my mind was locked in and running clean. Gavin Driscoll stood over me, his expensive leather shoes barely inches from my face. He was laughing, a cruel, hollow sound that carried through the quiet market. He was convinced he had broken me. He was convinced he had shown Cora that her father was nothing more than a frail, useless old man. He was riding the high of total arrogant victory, and that was exactly where I needed him. When a predator believes he has won, his attention drifts. He grows careless. Gavin was so consumed with humiliating me, so drunk on his own ego, that he never noticed my right hand moving slowly toward the heavy wool fabric of his custom-tailored overcoat. "Please!" I whimpered, letting my voice splinter with manufactured terror. "I am sorry. Just leave her alone." I shifted my weight on the floor, feigning a struggle to push myself upright. As I moved, I let my right arm graze clumsily against the deep side pocket of his coat. To anyone watching it, looked like the uncoordinated flailing of a frightened old man. But to someone who had spent 3 decades planting surveillance equipment on international fugitives, it was a flawlessly executed sleight of hand. Pinched between my fingers were two pieces of federal-grade technology. The first was a GPS tracking beacon, no bigger than a dime, invisible to any commercial sweep. The second was a microscopic audio transmitter, originally engineered for deep-cover counterterrorism work. In one smooth motion, disguised as a desperate grab at his coat for balance, I slipped both devices deep into the lining of his pocket. "Don't touch me, you piece of trash!" Gavin barked, stepping back and swatting my arm away. I let my hand drop to the floor and curled into a tight ball, as though his sudden movement had frightened me into stillness. It was done. The payload was delivered. Gavin Driscoll was now moving through the world with a federal listening post sitting comfortably in his pocket. Every step he took, every conversation he held, every frantic call he placed to his syndicate bosses, I would hear every word. Gavin straightened his lapels, his expression settling into a mask of pure disgust. "I will give you until tonight to pack your bags and come back to the city," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss aimed squarely at Cora. "If I do not hear from you by midnight, I am activating the judge. I am freezing your parents' bank accounts, and then I am coming back to that cabin to finish this. Don't make me come back to the woods, Cora." He turned on his heel and strode out of the aisle, his heavy footsteps fading toward the automatic doors. Cora dropped to her knees beside me, her face drained of color and streaked with fresh tears. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders and tried to help me sit up. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice shaking hard. "Oh my God. Dad, are you okay? I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I waited until I heard the distant chime of the sliding doors at the front of the store. I waited until I was certain Gavin was crossing the parking lot, completely unaware that he had just placed the keys to his entire criminal empire into my hands. Then the trembling in my hands stopped. The frightened hunch left my shoulders. I sat up smoothly, brushing the dust from my denim work shirt. I looked at my daughter, and the terrified old man she had just witnessed was gone. My face settled into the cold, deliberate focus of a U.S. Marshal running an operation. "I am fine, sweetheart," I said, my voice low, even and utterly steady. Cora froze, staring at me in shock. The tears slowed, replaced by pure bewilderment. "But he shoved you," she stammered. "You hit that floor so hard." "I let him shove me," I told her, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I needed him within reach. I needed him to feel untouchable. When a man like Gavin feels powerful, he stops looking for the trap." "Trap!" Cora echoed, dragging a tear from her cheek. "Dad, what did you do?" I got to my feet and offered her my hand. She took it, and I brought her gently upright. I retrieved her fallen basket from the floor and placed it back in her grip. "I just put a collar on him," I said quietly. "He thinks he is walking out of here to ruin our lives. He has no idea he is stepping straight into a federal monitoring net. Every move he makes from this point forward, every word out of his mouth, I am going to know about it. We are going to let him go back to the city. We are going to let him feel like he has won. And then we are going to burn his entire world to the ground." I guided a still-stunned Cora toward the checkout lanes and paid for our few items with cash. We walked out to the battered 2000 Chevy pickup without a word. As I turned the engine over and pulled onto the quiet rural road, the familiar cold rhythm of a hunt settled into my bones. Gavin Driscoll had just crossed the point of no return. He had threatened my family. He had put his hands on me. He thought he was running a game of intimidation. He had no idea the board had flipped and that he was now nothing more than a blip on a tracking screen. I drove Cora back to the property in silence, letting the steady hum of the old truck ease her frayed nerves. Lenora met us at the front door. She asked nothing about the grocery store or the dried tears on our daughter's face. She simply pulled Cora into her arms and steered her toward the warmth of the kitchen. I went straight down the hallway to my study and locked the solid walnut door behind me. It was time to go to work. I powered up the encrypted receiver I had drawn from the steel safe earlier that morning. The digital frequency found the tracking beacon almost at once. I settled the heavy black headphones over my ears and shut my eyes, letting everything else fall away. The audio feed from the microscopic transmitter buried in the lining of Gavin's coat was startlingly clear. I could hear the deep roar of his luxury car engine and the rhythm of his rapid, agitated breathing. Gavin was driving recklessly fast. I listened as he jabbed a button on his dashboard to dial out. The line rang twice before a cold, abrasive voice picked up. The man on the other end carried a thick Eastern European accent. and his tone held not a trace of human warmth. Gavin sounded nothing like himself now. The arrogant looming bully who had cornered my daughter in a grocery aisle had evaporated entirely. In his place was a frightened, scrambling middleman fighting to save his own skin. He stumbled through an explanation of the sudden delay in the real estate transfers, telling his offshore handler that the domestic holding accounts had hit a temporary snag. He tried to pin it on Cora. He told the man on the phone that his girlfriend had run and might be attempting to complicate the corporate structure to squeeze money out of him. The voice on the phone had no patience for his excuses. The handler made clear with chilling precision that $5 million was sitting in the Delaware holding account, waiting to be laundered through domestic contractors. Gavin was given exactly 48 hours to move the funds. If the money didn't clear by then, they would dispatch a cleanup crew to deal with Gavin permanently. The line went dead. I listened to Gavin pound his fist against the steering wheel, screaming in raw, uncontrolled panic. I had everything I needed, a clean digital recording of Gavin acknowledging syndicate funds and communicating directly with his offshore handlers. I pulled the audio file from the receiver and packaged it alongside the offshore routing numbers my contact Denton had sourced for me earlier in the day. I opened a classified communications portal on my satellite phone and sent the full encrypted package directly to my old Federal Task Force commander in Washington. I attached a brief message directing them to follow the money and prepare for a major asset seizure. Then, I picked up the phone and called Warren Pelham. I told him I had the smoking gun that the syndicate had given Gavin a 48-hour window to move the cash. I told Warren it was time to drop the hammer. Warren didn't hesitate for a second. He had spent the entire afternoon assembling a devastating legal strike. Drawing on his high-level corporate clearance and the offshore evidence I had just delivered, Warren filed an emergency injunction with a federal judge executed under the cover of an imminent Securities and Exchange Commission audit. Before we go any further, what you're about to hear is the moment when everything Gavin thought he controlled begins to unravel. The stakes are about to get very high, very fast. I want to ask you something. If someone were quietly working against you behind a friendly face, would you move the moment you suspected it? Or would you wait and build your case in silence first? When you want to freeze a man like Gavin, you don't simply lock his personal checking account. You sever his financial arteries. Warren specifically targeted the Delaware shell companies Gavin was running as his primary laundering operations. By classifying the sudden surge of anonymous foreign capital as a critical and immediate national security threat, Warren bypassed the usual sluggish civil court delays entirely. It was a flawless, ruthless legal maneuver. Within 20 minutes, a federal hold had been placed on every corporate asset tied to Gavin's name. The money was trapped. The accounts were frozen solid. The shell companies were effectively dead. I kept the headphones on, listening closely to the live feed from Gavin's coat pocket. He had parked and walked into an exclusive high-end restaurant downtown. I could hear the faint clink of expensive glassware and the murmur of soft jazz drifting through the dining room. Gavin ordered a double bourbon, trying desperately to steady his fraying nerves. He was sitting there in the dark, working through how to force my daughter back to sign those settlement papers. He believed he still had 48 hours to bring his problems under control. He thought he could still work the board and muscle his way back from the edge. He had absolutely no idea that his entire empire had just been erased with the stroke of a federal pen. I settled back in my chair and took a slow, measured breath. The trap had been executed perfectly. Gavin's money was completely gone. His power was nothing but a mirage, and his violent bosses were already watching the clock. I had severed his supply line without ever setting foot inside a courtroom. The beast was finally bleeding, and the scent of it in the water was going to drive him out of his mind. He was about to discover he had no options left. And when a man like Gavin comes to terms with having nothing left to lose, he makes the most catastrophic mistake of his life. I kept those headphones pressed tight against my ears and listened as Gavin Driscoll's entire world began coming apart at the seams. He was still perched at the bar of that high-end downtown restaurant. I could pick up the ambient noise of the dining room, the low current of expensive conversation, and the ring of heavy crystal. Gavin had moved on to a second double bourbon, trying to drown the rising dread of the 48-hour deadline his syndicate handlers had handed him. He thought he still had room to maneuver. He thought the board was still his. "Sir, your bill," the bartender said politely but with a clipped edge. I heard the creak of leather as Gavin reached for his wallet. He laid down a heavy corporate credit card, the kind that usually guaranteed instant deference. A pause filled by the ambient hum of the restaurant. Then the bartender came back, and the courteous tone had been replaced by something flat and professional. "I am sorry, sir," the bartender said. "This card has been declined." "Declined?" Gavin's voice snapped upward into immediate arrogant indignation. "That is impossible. Run it again." "There is no limit on that account." "I did run it again, sir," the bartender replied. "The terminal is showing the account has been frozen by the issuer. Do you have another form of payments before?" Did I it? I could hear the frantic rustling as Gavin tore through his wallet and produced a personal platinum card. "Here," he muttered, his irritation barely contained. "Use this one and bring me another drink." The silence that followed stretched out painfully. I pictured Gavin sitting there, adjusting his cuffs, working to keep his air of invincibility intact, while his pulse climbed a little higher. The bartender returned, and this time he made no effort to soften it. "Sir, this card is also declined. The terminal is flagging a total asset freeze across all accounts linked to your name. You will need to provide an alternative form of payment immediately, or I will have to bring the manager over." Gavin didn't argue. The weight of it landed on him like a physical blow. Every trace of arrogant bluster drained away at once. I heard him scrambling, pulling a wad of emergency cash from his money clip, slapping it onto the bar, and nearly bolting from the restaurant. The audio feed caught the sound of his labored breathing as he crossed the pavement at a near sprint toward his car. He yanked the door shut, sealing himself inside. He started dialing immediately, voice shaking with undisguised fear as he reached his primary financial controller. "Why are my cards declining?" Gavin demanded the moment the line connected. "Why is the bank telling me my accounts are frozen?" The controller sounded every bit as terrified. "Gavin, I don't know what's happening," he stammered. "The banks aren't communicating with us. The holding accounts in Delaware are completely locked. I tried to access the corporate portal, and it's showing a federal injunction notice. The Securities and Exchange Commission has initiated an emergency audit. Gavin, they have frozen everything. Every single penny is trapped." Gavin let out a sound that sat somewhere between a gasp and a scream. "The SEC," he choked. "How why the offshore transfers were clean. We structured the deposits exactly the way they instructed us to." "It wasn't a random flag, Gavin," the controller said, his voice dropping to a frightened whisper. "The injunction specifically targeted the primary holding entity, the one registered under Cora Corbett's name." Gavin dropped the phone. I heard it strike the center console. He began to hyperventilate, pulling at the air in ragged, shallow bursts as the carefully constructed walls of his world came down all at once. The money was gone. The shell company was dead. The federal government was tearing through his ledgers right now. And the worst realization of all was only just beginning to surface. His secondary burner phone started ringing. The sharp electronic tone cut through the silence inside the car. It was the secure line he reserved exclusively for his offshore handlers. Gavin stared at it. I could hear his ragged breathing as he sat there too terrified to answer. The phone rang on relentless and unforgiving. Finally, he picked it up, his hand trembling so hard the device rattled against his ear. "Driscoll!" The cold, flat voice of his syndicate handler announced through the speaker. "We are receiving notification from our domestic contractors. The holding accounts are locked. The capital transfers have failed. Explain this immediately." "It is a mistake," Gavin stammered, his voice pitching upward with panic. "It is a temporary hold. The bank flagged a routine anomaly. I can fix it. I just need a few hours." The handler cut him off, and the complete absence of emotion in the man's voice was chilling. "It is not a bank anomaly, Driscoll. We ran a shadow check on the corporate registration. The SEC has initiated a federal freeze. You exposed the pipeline. You lost our money." "No, no, listen to me." Gavin begged, tears choking his words entirely. "It was not me. I did not expose anything. It was her. It was Cora. She is the registered officer on that account. She found out about the offshore deposits. She left this morning. She must have gone to the police. She is the one who flagged the accounts. I can fix this. I can find her. I can make her retract everything. Please just give me until tonight." "We do not grant extensions, Driscoll." The handler said, his voice settling into a deadly calm. "You have until midnight to recover the capital and secure the registered officer. If the freeze is not lifted by 12:01, you are entirely expendable. The cleanup protocol will be initiated." The line went dead. Gavin sat alone in the dark, silent car, sobbing without control. He was completely broken. His money, his power, his polished facade, all of it had been stripped to nothing in the span of a few hours. He was a dead man, walking in somewhere underneath the panic. He knew it. But a cornered animal is extraordinarily dangerous. His panic began curdling into something uglier, a violent, frantic paranoia. He believed Cora had gone to the authorities. He was convinced she had single-handedly brought down his operation. In his mind, she was the only loose thread standing between him and execution at the hands of his bosses. He knew nothing about me. He had no idea about the federal tracking devices or the sharp legal team I had pointed at him like a weapon. All he knew was that he had to silence my daughter before midnight. I listened as Gavin picked the phone back up. His hands were still shaking, but his voice had gone hard, cold, and ugly with desperation. He pulled up his messages and began typing with furious speed. I knew exactly what he was composing. The final desperate ultimatum. The trap was perfectly set. The beast was bleeding out and it was about to charge headlong into the dark. I kept listening through those heavy black headphones as the silence inside Gavin's car stretched out like a held breath. He had just ended the call with his syndicate handlers. The 48-hour deadline hung over him like a blade. But the true shape of his situation was far worse than that. He didn't have 48 hours. His domestic accounts were frozen solid. His offshore deposits were bouncing back. He had no way whatsoever to reach the capital. He needed to save his own life. The panic that had been propelling him began curdling into something else entirely. I could hear it in the sudden erratic rhythm of his breathing, the frantic gasping slowing, giving way to the heavy measured exhales of a man who has exhausted every exit. When a predator understands he is cornered, he stops looking for an escape and starts looking for something to destroy. I heard the sharp metallic click of his center console opening. There was the dense thud of something solid being moved around, followed by the unmistakable sound of a pistol slide being racked. He was checking a weapon. A cold, familiar feeling moved through me. Gavin was no longer functioning as a corrupt businessman trying to salvage what remained of his empire. He had crossed into raw violence. He picked up his phone again. Keys clicked in rapid succession as he typed. I already knew who he was messaging before the notification even reached my daughter's phone down the hall. I pulled the headphones off and left my study, moving quickly toward the living room. Cora was on the sofa, knees drawn tight to her chest, staring blankly at the dark screen of her phone sitting on the coffee table. Lenora was beside her with a book open, but her posture was rigid, her eyes sweeping the tree line outside the window in steady intervals. The phone screen lit up with a hard buzz. Cora flinched, a small, involuntary sound escaping her. She reached for it, her hand trembling so badly she nearly fumbled it to the floor. She studied the screen for a long moment, the color leaving her face entirely. Her breath caught, and a single tear slipped free, tracing a quiet path down her cheek. "What does it say?" Lenora asked, her voice calm, but with steel underneath it. Cora looked up at me, eyes wide with raw terror. She extended the phone, her hand still shaking. I took it and looked at the glowing screen. The message from Gavin was brief and completely stripped of his usual arrogant posturing. It read, "I know what you did. I am coming to the cabin tonight. No cops, or you are all dead." He wasn't coming to negotiate. He wasn't coming to haul her back to downtown Charlotte to sign fraudulent settlement papers. He had convinced himself that Cora was solely responsible for the collapse of his laundering operation. He believed she had gone to the authorities and exposed the syndicate pipeline. In his fractured, desperate reasoning, silencing her was the only way to demonstrate loyalty to his offshore bosses and scrape together a little more time to run. "He wants to kill us," Cora whispered, her voice barely holding together. "He actually wants to kill us. Dad, we have to leave. We have to grab what we can and go right now. We can find a motel. We can cross into another state. We just cannot be here when he shows up." She was on her feet before she'd finished the sentence, scanning the room, as though an exit might materialize from the walls. The panic was consuming her, gutting her capacity to think straight. I placed a firm, steady hand on her shoulder and stopped her. "We are not running, Cora," I said, my voice low and completely even. "Are you insane?" she cried, tears cutting down her face. "He has a gun, Dad. I know he has a gun. He told me once he bought it for protection. If he comes through that door, he is not going to sit down and talk. He is going to hurt you. He is going to hurt Mom. And it is all because of me." I looked at my daughter and let the full weight of my calm settle over her rising hysteria. I had spent 30 years watching frightened people try to outrun monsters. Running never works. It only relocates the confrontation. When you flee, you surrender every tactical advantage you have. You let the predator pick the time and the ground. Gavin thinks we are prey, I told her, keeping my tone perfectly measured. He thinks he is driving up here tonight to find a frightened woman and two helpless old people cowering in the dark. If we run, he controls everything. He will track us down because he has absolutely nothing left to lose. But what can we do? She sobbed, hugging herself tightly. We cannot fight him. Lenora rose from the sofa. She crossed the room and cupped Cora's tear-streaked face gently in both hands. You need to listen to your father, Lenora said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had spent decades putting dangerous men behind federal bars. Gavin Driscoll is a desperate amateur playing a game he does not understand. Your father is a professional who wrote the rules. Cora blinked, her gaze moving back and forth between us. The confusion cut momentarily through the terror. What do you mean? She asked. I released her shoulder and walked to the large front window, looking out at the fading light settling over the dense woods surrounding our property. Gavin had made his choice. He had decided to escalate this from a financial dispute into an armed confrontation. He believed he was driving to our home to commit murder. I am going to make a phone call, I said, turning back to face her. And then we are going to get ready for company. Gavin wants to come to the cabin tonight. We are going to let him come. We are going to let him walk right up to the front door. And then we are going to show him exactly what happens when you threaten the wrong family. Cora could not hold still. She paced the full length of the living room, hands moving frantically through her hair. She kept picking things up off the coffee table, a coaster, a magazine, a decorative candle, and setting them back down just as fast. Her mind was shattered by the reality of Gavin's message. He was coming tonight. He had a gun. He intended to kill us. Dad, please, she begged, wheeling toward me, tears streaming. We have the truck. We can go right now. We can find a motel off the interstate and call the local police from the road. Tell them he broke in. Please don't make us stay here. If he brings people from his organization, we don't stand a chance. I let her get it all out. When someone is drowning in panic, you don't try to speak over them. You wait until they run out of breath, and then you throw them the lifeline. Lenora stood quietly near the fireplace, arms folded, holding the unshakable calm she had built over years of prosecuting violent men. She didn't try to soothe Cora this time. She just watched me, because she knew this was exactly the moment to pull back the curtain. With your stars, I said, my voice soft, but carrying enough weight to stop her cold. Come over here and sit down. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the front door. Dad, there is no time to... Sit down, Cora, Lenora said, not a request. The tone of a woman who commanded federal courtrooms. Cora blinked, caught off guard by her mother's sudden authority, and slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the sofa. I crossed the room to the large oak bookcase built into the far wall. It held decades of classic novels, photo albums, and dusty encyclopedias. I reached behind a thick leather-bound volume of historical biographies and pressed a hidden latch. With a soft mechanical click, a section of the shelving swung forward and opened like a heavy door. Cora let out a small, confused gasp. Behind the false bookcase was a recessed alcove lined with matte black steel. Inside the alcove sat a wide, high-definition surveillance monitor and a sophisticated communications terminal that looked entirely out of place in our rustic mountain cabin. The screen was divided into more than a dozen separate grids, each showing a crystal-clear night vision feed of the deep woods, the gravel driveway, the main access road, and the perimeter gate. What is that? Cora whispered, her eyes fixed on the glowing screens. Are those cameras on our property? I didn't answer right away. I reached into the alcove and opened a small reinforced lockbox resting on the shelf below the monitor. I felt the heavy, familiar weight of solid silver and brass. I drew it out, holding it loosely in my right hand, and walked back to the coffee table where my daughter sat. I stood in front of her for a moment, letting the silence fill the room. Then I slowly opened my hand and set the object down on the polished wood of the coffee table. The object hit the wood with a dense, ringing clank. A silver star pressed into a brass ring, the seal of the United States government cut deep into the metal, United States Marshal. The words caught the light from the living room lamps and threw it back. Cora couldn't move. Her eyes traveled from the star to the wall of glowing surveillance screens and back again, making the trip 2, 3 times, as though repetition might help her brain catch up. Everything she thought she understood about the quiet, stooped man who had raised her was coming apart at the seams. "Dad?" Her voice was almost nothing. Where did this come from? How did you—" I dragged a chair close and dropped into it so we were eye to eye, forearms on my knees, weighted forward. 30 years, I said. That is how I got it. 30 years of work. I let that land before I continued. I told her I understood why she had believed what she believed: the dull government desk, the paperwork, the unremarkable retirement to this cabin in the hills. Every word of that version was something Lenora and I had constructed deliberately, because a normal childhood required a normal father. The truth would have stolen that from her. She shook her head, still trying to find solid ground. "Were you some kind of cop?" Lenora moved in before I could answer, settling a hand on my shoulder. "Not a cop, Cora. A patrolman writes traffic citations. He breaks up arguments between neighbors." Her voice was measured and precise. "Your father ran federal fugitive operations." I held my daughter's gaze and let her actually see me. Not the denim work shirt, not the gray at my temples, but the man underneath all of it. "Gavin thinks he is pulling up to a farmhouse full of frightened civilians," I said. "He has built his entire sense of power on laundering syndicate cash and keeping a corrupt judge on his payroll. In his mind, that makes him someone to fear. But he walked out of that grocery store today carrying a federal transmitter I planted on him, and he has no idea his offshore money has been locked since this afternoon." The color left Cora's face entirely, her hands pressed flat against her mouth. "You froze his accounts," she managed. "He is furious because of you. He is coming here because of you. He is coming because there is nowhere left for him to go." I told her, my voice flat and certain. "A trapped animal doesn't think it charges. He has convinced himself that you were the one who brought his operation down, and that putting you in the ground is the only card he has left to play. He believes he is the hunter walking into these woods tonight." I paused. "He is not. 3 decades, the worst men this country ever produced, cartel heads, men who melted into foreign jungles and dared anyone to follow, men whose reputations alone made marshals hesitate. I hadn't hesitated. I'd brought them all back." I turned and gestured at the screens behind me. "Military spec cameras, Cora, wall to wall. Not a shadow on this land they don't catch. There are pressure sensors sunk into the gravel at the gate. They register the weight of an incoming vehicle before it reaches the first bend. Gavin Driscoll is making that drive with zero intelligence, zero preparation, and zero idea what is waiting for him. He built nothing here. I built everything." Cora's eyes shifted to the green-washed night vision grids, the tree line rendered in eerie, silent detail. Something in her face was changing. The white-knuckled dread that had owned her all day was losing its grip, replaced by something wider. Something that hadn't found a name yet. The man she had spent months running from, the one who'd taken her money, her confidence, her sense of safety, was steering himself straight into a net. "Are you actually going to shoot him?" she asked. It wasn't hysterical. It was almost quiet. I exhaled slowly. "Shooting him would be the easy version, and I don't need it. I want him to cross onto this property. I want him standing on that porch spelling out his intentions for the cameras in his own words. He is going to hand us documented proof of premeditated criminal threat on federal land, on tape. After that, the cage drops, and it will be heavy enough that he will still be sitting inside it when he is old and gray and completely forgotten." I got to my feet, lifted the badge from the table, and tucked it away. The familiar pull of that weight against my hip steadied something in me. I looked at Cora for a long moment. The change in her eyes was real. She wasn't a woman waiting for someone else to save her anymore. She was beginning to understand what she was actually standing behind. "Leave the bags where they are," I told her. "We are not clearing out ahead of Gavin Driscoll. Tonight we end this." Dale left the room and moved down the hall to reach his task force commander. The quiet he left behind had texture to it, just the faint electronic breath of the monitors inside the wall. Cora stayed where she was, arms wrapped around herself, fixed on those glowing screens. The trembling hadn't stopped, but its character had shifted. Fear was still in there, but it had company now. Lenora crossed to the sofa and sat close beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so practiced it required no thought. Lenora had faced down killers and extortionists from behind a prosecutor's table for the length of a career. She had a talent for locating the crack in panic and widening it into calm. "How long," Cora asked softly, eyes still on the feeds. "How long have you known what he really was?" "From the first week," Lenora said. Her voice had that easy, unhurried quality that only comes from knowing something down to the bone. "I was still junior staff in the federal prosecutor's office working a sprawling racketeering case. We had a cartel boss, serious man, serious resources, who had vanished clean into the Great Smoky Mountains wilderness. Everybody lost him. Local agencies' federal tracking units gone after 3 days. He had millions backing him and armed people guarding every approach. The working assumption was that he was simply gone." Cora pulled her gaze from the monitors. "But Dad went in." Lenora's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something warmer and more private than pride. "The Marshal Service sent your father alone. No desk, no suit, no backup. He went into those mountains and he didn't resurface for 3 weeks. Lived rough, the whole stretch cold ground, open rain tracking impressions in the mud and the bark that trained people had walked right past. He kept himself going on ration bars and creek water patient as stone until the timing was exactly right. When he walked that cartel boss into my courtroom, the man was shaking. He couldn't stop looking back at your father, like something had followed him out of the dark that had no business being there." Lenora's voice softened just slightly. "That afternoon, I decided I was going to marry him. Any person who could hold that much discipline, that much controlled force, and still be gentle. I knew nothing was ever going to get through him to the people he cared about." She took Cora's hands in both of hers, steadying them. She needed her daughter to feel, not just understand, the gap between the man driving toward them and the man outside on that porch. "We gave you the ordinary story because the real one carried real risk," Lenora said. "We wanted your childhood to belong to you, school friends sleep without nightmares about people your father had locked away looking to settle scores. The truth is that he ran with the Special Operations Unit. When a target was too dangerous or too buried for a conventional team, they sent him." Cora sat quietly now, the jagged rhythm of her breathing gradually evening out, as her father's history displaced the last of Gavin Driscoll's shadow. "He went after people who genuinely believed no one could reach them." Lenora went on, her tone unhurried and absolute. "Human traffickers moving through the punishing heat of the Sonoran Desert. Domestic terrorists dug into the mountains of Wyoming, waiting out the seasons, certain the winters would outlast any pursuit. Arms dealers barricaded inside, reinforced compounds scattered across the Appalachians men, with private armies, weapons stockpiles, and cash flowing in volumes most people can't picture. Every one of them stacked their odds carefully. Every one of them decided their money and their brutality were enough to make them permanent. And every one of them found out they were wrong at the exact moment your father came through the trees and closed the cuffs." Lenora let a beat of silence do its work. Then her voice shifted, the warmth burned off, replaced by something precise and cold. "Gavin Driscoll is not in that category, Cora. Not remotely. He is a vain, reckless man who got access to serious money and mistook that for being serious himself. He doesn't have instincts. He has a temper. He doesn't have discipline. He has lawyers and leverage. The only tool he has ever actually mastered is making ordinary people feel small. That is not the same thing as being dangerous. Not even close." Cora turned her eyes back to the monitors, studying the long, dark ribbon of gravel that wound toward the house. "He told me he wasn't coming alone," she said quietly, the last traces of dread pushing toward the surface. "He said, 'No cops, or we are all dead.'" Lenora answered with a short, easy laugh, utterly unbothered. "Numdu, good. Let him bring whoever he wants," she said. "The men Gavin scraped together tonight are bottom-rung hired hands chasing easy money. They think they're showing up to batter down a door and put the fear of God into a retired couple. What they cannot possibly know is that they're stepping into a blind ambush laid by someone who once trained federal strike teams in the art of forced entry. Your father's greatest weapon is patience," Lenora said, folding Cora's hands inside her own. "Gavin and men cut from his cloth self-destruct every time because their pride cannot absorb a loss of control. Emotion drives them. Arrogance steers them. They barrel in loud, hurling threats, leaving a digital trail wide enough to follow from a mile back. Your father issues no warnings. His voice never climbs. His cards never show. He holds still. He studies the ground beneath him. He accounts for every factor, then stands back and watches the target march straight into an enclosure it will never walk out of. For the past 48 hours, he has been quietly dismantling every layer of protection Gavin Driscoll imagined he had. Lenora freed Cora's hands and swept an arm toward the bank of glowing feeds lighting the shadowed alcove. Those screens, Cora, your father, wired every inch of that system himself. Each camera, each motion sensor, each hardened lock on this property was purpose-built to hold off a coordinated attack. We didn't come out to these mountains to disappear. We chose this place because it hands your father every tactical advantage there is. Gavin believes he's headed up here to gun us down in the dark. What he is actually doing is rolling straight into a federal kill box someone else designed around him. Cora pulled in a long breath and let it out slowly. The shaking that had gripped her shoulders went quiet. The cornered, white-faced woman Gavin had stalked through the grocery store simply wasn't there anymore. Her spine straightened. Her weight settled back into the cushions. The accounts of cartel kingpins and wilderness fugitive hunts had worked precisely the effect Lenora had wanted. They had shrunk Gavin Driscoll to something manageable, something beatable. "He's going to prison, isn't he?" Cora said. Her voice carried no tremor now. Lenora's smile returned the same cold certainty behind her eyes that a lifetime of delivering justice had put there. "A federal penitentiary," Lenora said. "He forfeits the money, the freedom, every last thing he thought made him untouchable. And every morning for the rest of his miserable life, he'll wake up knowing the stooped old man he knocked to the floor was the one who engineered his total ruin. Take a breath now, sweetheart. Your father's nearly off the phone, and we have preparations to make before company arrives." I left Cora on the sofa, the pale light of the surveillance array shimmering across her wide, shell-shocked face. Lenora remained at her side, still steady the eye of the storm. I moved down the corridor toward my study, something old and familiar settling into my chest, the particular calm of a tactical plan already in motion. No fear left. No adrenaline either, just a clean, cold, crystalline focus. I lifted the encrypted satellite phone from the desk. Its green display threw a pale wash across the dark wood surface. I punched in a string of digits that would never touch a commercial cell tower. The signal was threading through a secure military relay, cutting entirely around the civilian network. One ring. That was all it took before a clipped, rough voice came on. "Clyde Hargrove, currently serving as Deputy Director of Operations for the United States Marshal Service. 30 years back, Clyde had been my tactical commander on the cartel task force. We'd put in years side by side in the field, tracking men who fancied themselves untouchable. We had bled in the same dirt, shivered through the same freezing nights, hauled the same monsters out of the jungle and into daylight." Dale Clyde said, the formal edge dropping from his voice the instant he knew who it was. "That encrypted package you fired off this afternoon, I have it. My finance people are running it down as we speak. You just laid the offshore routing numbers for a syndicate we've been chasing for 5 years. Right in my lap. Please tell me you're not neck-deep in a firefight." "No firefight, Clyde." I said my tone level, but I'm about to receive some uninvited company at my property in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina. A low sound worked its way up from Clyde, not quite a laugh, nothing close to amusement. "Company," he said flatly. "Dale, talk to me. Why are you stirring up a hornet's nest with no backup in place?" I walked him through the entire tactical picture. Gavin Driscoll, a mid-level developer washing the syndicate's money through construction deals, had just watched every account he owned get locked. Panic had set in. He'd decided my daughter was the one who'd given him up, and he'd sent a text promising to arrive at my cabin that night with armed men and murder on his mind. Dead air on the line. When Clyde spoke again, every trace of warmth had left him. That was the commander's voice, the one I knew from the task force years. "He threatened your family." Not a question. He said it the way a verdict gets read. He did, I confirmed. He told Cora, "No cops or we are all dead." He's convinced he's rolling up here to put down a defenseless old man and a scared woman. He believes the numbers give him the advantage. Clyde exhaled long and deliberate. "That's a death sentence, Dale. The moment he crosses your property line with a weapon, you are legally cleared to defend your family with extreme prejudice. Say the word, and I'll put a local SWAT element on the highway to box him in before he gets close." "No," I said, shifting back in my chair. A highway intercept hands Gavin exactly what he needs. He raises his hands lawyers up before dawn and starts spinning a story about a friendly visit. The text becomes a misunderstanding. He already has a corrupt judge sitting in his back pocket. He'd tie Cora up in civil court for years, and with the right legal team, he might even find a way to chip apart the syndicate charges. The highway is off the table, Clyde. I need him to finish the approach. You're letting him come all the way in, Clyde said, reading it immediately. I want him through the perimeter gate, I said. I want him on my driveway with a weapon in his hand and murder written plainly across his intent. I want the military-grade cameras I mounted this morning, capturing every second of it. But I'm not looking to end him, Clyde. A body gives the syndicate a reason to send someone competent next time. I need him breathing and in federal custody so he can sit inside that cage and slowly understand what he drove himself into. I want him staring at 40 years of concrete walls with nothing to think about except the old man he shoved down in a grocery store. What I need from you is a containment team, people who know how to move through heavy woods in total silence and put him down without a shot fired. Seal this property, Clyde. I want the net so tight, nothing slips the perimeter. Nothing. Understood, Dale, Clyde said, and I could already hear keystrokes behind his voice. I have a rapid response unit sitting at a federal staging facility 40 miles out. They're moving now. Unmarked vehicles. Zero light signature on the approach. They'll filter into the tree line and build a perimeter around the entire structure. No sirens, no lights, pure shadow. I'm grateful, Clyde, I told him. Have your team leader raise me on frequency delta. I'll be watching their approach on the sensor grid. 90 minutes, Dale, Clyde said. Stay low. Let him come to you. I set the satellite phone in the hidden drawer and closed it. Everything was locked in. The machinery of federal law enforcement was already turning. Gavin Driscoll was out there somewhere on a dark road, certain he was driving toward an easy kill. He had no conception of what was actually waiting for him, a layered tactical trap built and baited at the highest levels of the federal government. I came out of the study and crossed back into the living room. Cora hadn't moved from the sofa. Her gaze was fixed to the surveillance feeds like she couldn't afford to look away. The fear had drained out of her, completely traded for something quieter and far heavier, the slow, staggering recognition of who her parents actually were. Lenora came through from the kitchen, a steaming mug in each hand. She passed one to Cora, then extended the other toward me. Everything's in motion, I said to Lenora, wrapping my hand around the mug. Clyde's dropping a tactical unit on us. Tree line will be covered inside 90 minutes. Lenora took a measured sip from her own cup. Her face was composed, calm, entirely unafraid. She looked utterly at peace. Beautiful night for a drive, she said softly, her gaze drifting out toward the solid wall of darkness beyond the front window. I crossed the room to the heavy locked cabinet beside the fireplace. A short combination, the steel doors swung open. Inside, cradled in padded mounts, sat a customized 20-gauge tactical shotgun. Flawless machinery, perfectly kept and brutally effective at close quarters. I drew it out and ran through the chamber and safety checks with the unhurried ease of long practice. I had no intention of firing it tonight. Clyde's people would handle the actual takedown, but you don't let a wolf onto your land without something within arm's reach. I slung the weapon over my shoulder and moved toward the front door. Cora rose from the sofa, her eyes tracking me. "Dad," she said, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" "Getting some air, sweetheart," I told her, and gave her the kind of small, settled smile designed to slow a racing heart. "The coffee's still hot, and the night's not bad. You stay in here with your mother. Keep your eyes on those screens. Whatever sounds you hear outside, don't touch this door." I stepped out onto the wide porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The air met me cold and clean, carrying pine and wet soil. Around the house, the woods held their silence like a held breath, an unbroken curtain of darkness on every side. I made my way to the weathered wooden porch chair, the one that had collected more of my quiet evenings than I could count since I'd retired. I settled in, laying the shotgun across my thighs, where the shadow of the railing would swallow it completely. I lifted the heavy stoneware coffee mug and took a slow pull. My eyes found the gravel driveway stretching out toward the main gate, lost somewhere in the dark. The single dim bulb strung above the porch threw a thin yellow wash across the planks immediately beneath it and left everything else, including me, to the dark. I let the chair find its rhythm, let the stillness of the forest press in around me. The trap was laid. The perimeter was live. Federal operatives were threading through the tree line without a sound. Gavin Driscoll was out there somewhere on the road, a desperate, prideful man, hurtling headlong toward the end of everything he'd built. I brought the mug up again, fingers resting easy against the shotgun's cool steel. All that was left now was to wait. The heavy iron gate at our property entrance was engineered to absorb a serious collision, but I had deliberately left the primary electronic lock disengaged. I wanted Gavin to feel the chain resist him, but I also wanted him to believe he'd forced his way through on his own. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, the perimeter sensors fired a rapid sequence of red alerts across the concealed monitor inside the living room. I was in the weathered wooden porch chair, the customized tactical shotgun lying invisible in the shadow across my lap. The solitary yellow bulb painted a pale circle around my boots, and beyond that the porch dissolved into the same pitch black that swallowed the long sweep of gravel driveway below. Then, a heavy engine note tore through the pine-hushed quiet. The black SUV never slowed for the gate. It accelerated into it, the steel push bar across the front bumper, punching through the iron with a metallic crash that rolled out through the trees like a gunshot. The chain gave both panels whipped inward, and the vehicle clawed up the driveway, trailing a rooster tail of dust and loose stone. No careful parking near the tree line. Gavin was running on raw adrenaline with nothing left to lose. He stood on the brakes, fishtailing to a stop, barely 50 feet from the bottom porch step. The engine stayed alive, muttering in the dark. All 4 doors came open at once. 3 shapes moved into the pale wash of the headlights. Gavin Driscoll came out of the driver's side. The polished, custom-tailored suit was gone. He had on a dark, heavy jacket, and his face had collapsed into something feral and desperate. A man who'd watched his entire constructed world start to dissolve and had decided that raw violence was the only door still open to him. In his right hand he had a solid iron tire, iron knuckles blanched from the force of his grip. His breathing came in ragged pulls, chest lurching, as though he'd sprinted the last mile on foot. He looked like a man broken loose from himself entirely. The other 2 came out of the passenger side and the rear. I sized them up in the time it takes to exhale. These weren't barroom hires. They moved with the practiced economy of men who'd done this before scanning sightlines, keeping their hands near their waistbands. Syndicate muscle dispatched to make certain Gavin finished what he'd started before anyone upstairs ran out of patience. The unmistakable dull sheen of large-caliber semi-automatics showed at their belts. Gavin didn't wait for them to secure anything. He turned and came straight up the driveway, boots grinding hard into the gravel eyes fixed on the cabin's front door, like he was already picturing smashing through it to find a frightened woman and a helpless old man cowering somewhere inside. He didn't notice me at all, sitting back in the shadow of the railing, until he'd covered half the distance. I lifted the heavy stoneware coffee mug and took a slow, unhurried sip. The faint ceramic click as it came back down against the wooden armrest cut right through the low idle of the SUV. Gavin's feet stopped. He stood there squinting into the dim yellow light, trying to make what he was seeing fit inside his head. The 2 enforcers spread immediately, drifting wide to flank him, palms hovering just clear of their weapons. Professionals, but rattled ones. When you've rehearsed a hard breach in your head and arrive to find the target sitting in the dark nursing a coffee, it throws every calculation you brought with you out the window. "Well, Gavin," I said. My voice was low, unhurried, carrying no trace of anything that resembled fear. "I will say you're right on schedule, though. I have to tell you you're doing real damage to my driveway." Gavin's chest kept working like bellows. The tire iron rose a few inches in his grip. Whatever composure had made him formidable in the lobby of his apartment building had been stripped away entirely, leaving something rawer and more dangerous in its place. "Where is she?" He shouted the words, fracturing at the edges. "Where is Cora? Bring her out here right now, old man." Another step toward me, the tire iron climbing higher. He was waiting for me to come up out of the chair. He was waiting for the begging to start the same helpless performance he'd staged in the grocery store aisle. I didn't give him either. I brought the mug up again, held his eyes straight on, and drank. "She's inside," I said, same easy tone. "But she's not stepping out, Gavin, and you are most definitely not stepping in. So, what do you say? We sit with this a moment, talk it through right here, before you do something permanent. You think this is funny?" Gavin bellowed, his face flooding dark red. He leveled the tire iron at my chest with a shaking hand. "You froze my accounts. You ran her up here to hide. I will beat you into the boards of this porch and drag her out of that house myself." He closed 2 more hard strides toward the steps, wholly consumed, nothing left in him but forward motion. Behind him, the two enforcers tightened their spread, angling in to support the breach. They believed they had every angle covered. They believed the math was entirely in their favor. What they could not know was that every foot of that gravel driveway they had crossed had been tracked confirmed and held in the crosshairs of federal snipers positioned in the tree line 50 yards out. The breach was done. Every target was inside the box. Time to close it. Gavin Driscoll pulled up at the base of the porch steps, chest heaving the solid iron tire, iron white-knuckled in his fist. His two enforcers bracketed him, hands curled around the grips at their waists, projecting as much lethal intent as the dark would let them. But I caught the hesitation underneath it. Professionals develop instincts, and their instincts were telling them something didn't add up. An old man alone sitting quiet in the dark over a cup of coffee that was not the picture they'd prepared for. It was the kind of variable that makes careful men slow down and reconsider. Gavin, though, had no careful left in him. All he could see was the same easy target from the grocery store aisle. "Where is she?" he screamed again, voice cracking at the top, the tire iron jabbing toward me. "Quit playing games, old man. You put Cora on this porch right now, or I swear to God, I'll pull you out of that chair, beat you to death, where you stand and torch this cabin with your wife still in it." Not a flinch, not a twitch toward the shotgun lying hidden in shadow across my lap. I raised the heavy stoneware coffee mug and took another slow, measured sip, letting the quiet stretch and pull, making him stand inside the total absence of any fear on my part. "You are making a lot of noise, Gavin," I said, my voice low and smooth and utterly steady. It carried across the porch without effort, cutting right through his ragged breathing. But noise does not fix what is broken for you. All it does is tell the wolves precisely where to look. Gavin planted his foot on the first wooden stair and hoisted the tire iron higher. The arrogance that had lived in him like a second spine, the same arrogance that filled that luxury apartment lobby, clawed its way back to the surface. "You think you're smart," he snarled, climbing another step. "You freeze my accounts. You run her up into the mountains. I have men here, I have a weapon, and I will level everything you care about if you don't hand her over right now." He took a third step. That was as far as I let him come. "You are carrying a debt of exactly $5,140,000 to the syndicate operating out of Cyprus." I said, my voice as level as a courtroom reading. Every syllable landed in the cold night air like something solid. Gavin locked up completely. His foot hung suspended above the fourth wooden stair. The tire iron dipped a fraction as the sheer weight of what I had just said collided with his adrenaline-soaked brain. "Your primary holding entity in Delaware has been frozen under a federal injunction, filed through the Securities and Exchange Commission." I continued ticking through the facts with surgical calm. "The offshore deposits have bounced back to the Cayman routing nodes. Your syndicate handlers gave you until exactly midnight to recover the capital." Gavin's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The blood left his face so fast he looked like something already dead standing there in the thin wash of the porch light. And to make the timeline entirely clear, I continued, never moving my eyes from his. "You received that deadline call while sitting alone in your car outside a high-end downtown Charlotte restaurant immediately after 2 of your credit cards were declined at the table. You stayed in that car afterward crying and hyperventilating before you picked up the phone and sent a threatening text message to my daughter." Behind him, the 2 syndicate enforcers traded a fast, alarmed look. They were muscle dispatched to make sure a local developer cleaned up his problem. Nobody had walked them through the actual scale of the disaster, and nothing in their experience had prepared them for an old man on a porch in the mountains, reciting classified international financial intelligence from memory. Gavin located his voice, though, barely. It arrived as a hollow, unsteady whisper. "Who are you?" I eased forward in the chair, slow and deliberate, letting the weak porch light find the edge of my face. "I am the man who slipped a federal GPS tracker and a microscopic audio transmitter into the right pocket of your tailored cashmere overcoat while you were occupied shoving me onto the floor of a grocery store aisle," I said, letting a cold smile settle at the corners of my mouth. "I am the man who has had a live feed on every panicked phone call you have placed over the last 3 days. I am the man who delivered your entire offshore laundering operation directly into the hands of the United States government." Gavin lurched backward, his boot slipping off the stair's edge. His hand drove into his coat pocket and came out with the 2 small black devices I had planted. He stood there staring at them in his open palm as if they might bite him. The full picture arrived for him all at once, and it arrived without mercy. He had never been pressuring a frightened civilian. He had never been dominating a fragile old man. He had been an oblivious courier carrying a live federal listening post straight into the center of his own criminal operation. "You set me up." Gavin choked tears born of pure panic pushing into his eyes. "You destroyed me. They are going to kill me. They are going to kill me because of you." "You destroyed yourself, Gavin," I replied, the warmth gone from my voice entirely replaced by the hard, flat authority of a federal officer. "You decided my daughter was a tool, a human shield for your dirty money. You decided you could threaten my family and use a corrupt local judge to drown us in legal debt. You decided your wealth and your arrogance put you beyond anyone's reach." I set the heavy stoneware coffee mug down on the wooden side table beside me. The sharp clink rang out clean in the charged silence. "But you forgot the oldest rule there is about these woods, Gavin." I told him, the certainty in my voice holding him exactly where he stood. "When you choose to hunt, you had better know with absolute certainty what is already waiting for you in the dark." Gavin looked at the tracker sitting in his palm, then up at the dark, solid face of the cabin. Whatever was left of his reason finally gave way. He screamed a raw animal sound terror, and fury wound together and turned the tire iron back toward me. He wheeled on the two armed men behind him, jabbing the iron bar in my direction. "Kill him!" he screamed, his voice flying apart at the seams. "Kill him right now and burn this place to the ground. No witnesses. Kill him!" The enforcers hesitated, hands going tight around their weapons. But that order was the last piece I had been waiting for. Gavin Driscoll had just directed two armed men to commit murder on my property. He had crossed the final line. The breach was complete. Every variable had locked into place. The trap was ready to close. I did not reach for the shotgun. I did not rise from the chair. I reached into the pocket of my denim work shirt, closed my fingers around a small black remote, and pressed the single red button. One press. That was all it took to release something that had been building for 90 minutes. I sat still and watched the mechanism I had assembled spring shut with perfect precision. The entire property detonated in white light. High-intensity tactical floods hidden up in the pine canopy and along the cabin roofline all fired at once. The darkness was simply gone. Gravel driveway, front lawn, iron gate, every inch of it, buried under a harsh blazing illumination that turned midnight into something close to noon. The violence of that shift was physically staggering. Gavin shrieked and threw both hands over his eyes, the solid iron tire iron tumbling from his grip. It rang off the wooden stairs and clattered to rest. The two syndicate enforcers clenched their eyes shut and threw their arms up against the glare. Their hands jerked instinctively away from the weapons at their waists. Temporarily blinded, effectively neutralized, and not a single round fired to get there. As their eyes fought to recover, a new element entered the picture. Slicing through the wall of white came dozens of bright red points of light. Laser sights carved through the haze of dust, still swirling around the idling SUV. They skimmed across the gravel and then settled with the patience of something inevitable onto their assigned targets. 4 solid crimson dots anchored to the chest of the left enforcer. 4 more found the forehead and torso of the right. And a cluster of a dozen red lasers converged directly over Gavin Driscoll's pounding heart. From the tree line bordering the driveway, the shadows began to move. Heavily armored tactical operators in dark combat gear stepped into the light with their rifles raised and perfectly steady. Behind them came figures in windbreakers, bold yellow letters, FBI and United States Marshal Service. The perimeter had folded inward on all sides, sealing every yard of that driveway and cutting off any thought of escape. Clyde Hargrove came around from behind the black SUV. His stride was unhurried, deliberate, carrying the full weight of federal authority behind every step. He raised a radio to his lips, and his voice came back amplified, clean and enormous, through a megaphone that turned the quiet mountain night into something else entirely. Federal agents, Clyde announced, his voice rolling across the property like a wave. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground, now." The 2 syndicate enforcers were professionals with enough experience to read exactly what they were standing inside. They understood the difference between a local police cordon and a fully coordinated federal killbox. They knew that any movement toward their waistbands would end their lives before their fingers made contact with steel. They did not weigh it long. Both men raised their hands, kicked their weapons out across the gravel, and went to their knees, then flat to the ground without another sound. Federal operators closed in fast, snapping cold steel cuffs onto their wrists and pulling them clear of the vehicles. Gavin Driscoll was left standing entirely alone at the foot of the porch stairs. The full weight of what had happened came down on him all at once. He lowered his hands from his face, blinking hard against the flood of white light. He took in his hired muscle-neutralized face down, cuffed on the gravel. He took in the ring of armored federal agents, rifles up, pressing in on every side. He looked down at the constellation of red laser dots burning through his jacket. His arrogance didn't crack. It simply ceased to exist. The wealthy, untouchable developer who had made my daughter's life a nightmare was gone without a trace. The man who had boasted about owning judges and grinding people into dust had been erased. What stood in his place was a terrified child who had wandered into a game whose rules he had never come close to understanding. Gavin let out a ragged, strangled sob. His knees buckled. He dropped onto the sharp gravel, hitting it hard the same driveway he had marched up in fury barely 2 minutes before. His arms folded across his stomach, and he curled into himself. Tears ran down his face and fell into the dirt below him. He was gasping, unable to pull a full breath, completely swallowed by panic. "Please," he wailed, the sound thin and wretched. "Please don't shoot me. I'm sorry. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll hand over the money. Just please don't let them kill me." He was bargaining. He was trying to tender an empire that had already been seized, offering it to men who already owned it. He clawed at the stones beneath him, begging for mercy from the operatives holding the rifles. It had hit him fully finally that he wasn't simply going to prison. He had led federal agents straight to the syndicate's money. That made him a liability. He was a dead man in either direction, and he knew it now. I sat in the weathered wooden porch chair and finished another slow sip of warm coffee. The operation had run without a single deviation. The threat was done, and my family was safe. I watched as Clyde directed 2 agents forward to collect Gavin. They took him by the arms, peeled his limp, sobbing frame off the gravel, and locked his wrists behind him. The reign of Gavin Driscoll was finished. I rose from the chair and left the heavy stoneware coffee mug on the small wooden table beside it. The porch boards gave a soft creak beneath my boots as I moved toward the steps. The tactical floods still hammered the driveway in hard white light, throwing long, dark shadows across the gravel and the tree line beyond. Gavin was on his knees amid a ring of federal agents, hands bound tight behind his back with heavy steel cuffs. He was weeping not the quiet, private kind, but the loud, ugly variety that belongs to men who've always bought or bullied their way out and have just discovered there's no one left to buy. I came down the wooden steps without hurrying. The federal operators moved aside without a word, opening a path. They knew exactly who I was, and they understood without being told what this moment called for. I stopped a few feet from Gavin and looked down at what was left of him. That expensive jacket, the same one where I'd placed the tracker, was wrecked, smeared with the dirt and grit of my driveway. He raised his head, face shining with sweat and tears. He searched my expression for some remnant of the fragile old man he had shoved to the floor, hoping that version of me might still have pity to offer. He found nothing. My eyes gave him nothing at all. "You told me you were going to burn my house to the ground." "Gavin," I said, my voice quiet but clean in the night air. "You told me you were going to destroy my daughter and leave my wife with nothing. You believed your money made you untouchable, but you never once thought to ask what I did before I came to live in these quiet mountains." Gavin convulsed with a sob, shaking his head in short, helpless arcs. "Please," he rasped, his voice collapsing into something barely human. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. Tell them to let me go. I'll give you everything. I'll vanish." "Ignorance is not a defense," I replied, keeping it even. "You chose to wade into deep water with syndicate money. Now you're going to drown in it. The federal government will put you in a concrete box for whatever remains of your natural life. And the men whose money you lost, the men you were laundering for, they maintain relationships inside those concrete boxes. You will not know a single quiet day for as long as you draw breath." I turned away from him. He was no longer a threat. He was wreckage waiting to be cleared. I gave a short nod to Clyde Hargrove, who stood nearby with his arms folded, watching the exchange. Clyde nodded back and signaled his people. They hauled Gavin upright, guided his limp, weeping body toward a waiting armored transport. The 2 syndicate enforcers were already loaded in the back, silent, still resigned. Clyde came to me and put out his hand. We shook the simple, firm grip of 2 men who had done this kind of work for a long time and understood what the other had just given. "We'll take it from here, Dale," Clyde said, keeping his voice low. My financial teams are already pulling apart his shell companies. We have more than enough to put him away for 50 years, and the offshore data you handed us will let us tear down the entire syndicate pipeline. Good work today. Go inside, take care of your family. Inside of 10 minutes, the tactical floods cut off. The heavy unmarked vehicles rolled in single file down the long gravel driveway and were swallowed by the dark. The perimeter folded away as quietly as it had assembled. The woods settled back into themselves, nothing left but pine branches moving in the night air. I turned and climbed back up the porch steps. The front door came open. Cora stepped out onto the porch with Lenora right behind her. My daughter looked out at the empty driveway, the empty patch of gravel where Gavin had been on his knees in the dirt just minutes before. Then she looked at me. 6 months of absolute terror had lifted entirely from her face. What replaced it was something deep and physical, a relief so complete it looked almost like exhaustion. She crossed the porch at a run and put her arms around my neck, pressing her face hard into my shoulder. I held her close, both arms around her, keeping her there. "It's over, sweetheart," I said quietly, my chin resting against the top of her head. "He is never going to hurt you again. I promise you that." Lenora came and wrapped her arms around both of us, her head resting against my back. The three of us stood there together on that quiet porch, a family that had taken a hard shot and hadn't broken. Time moves differently once the thing poisoning it is gone. It has been over a year since that night, and the shape of our lives is almost unrecognizable. Gavin Driscoll never made it to trial. The federal evidence was a mountain offshore financial record shell company, documentation, and the full audio, captured by the device I'd slipped into the pocket of his tailored cashmere overcoat. His legal team took one look at it and folded. He pleaded guilty to money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and a string of additional federal charges. He is currently serving a 60-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The syndicate he served was completely dismantled by Clyde's task force working from the routing numbers we had provided. Cora didn't just survive, she rebuilt. Warren Pelham, my longtime friend and one of the sharpest lawyers I have ever known, did exactly what he said he would. He untangled her fully from Gavin's network of fraudulent shell companies. He demonstrated to the federal courts that she had been a victim of identity theft and corporate fraud from the beginning. But Warren didn't stop there. He brought a sweeping civil suit against Gavin's remaining frozen assets, seeking damages for emotional distress and financial harm. The federal courts awarded Cora a settlement large enough that she will never have to worry about money again. She took that capital and moved to a beautiful coastal town, where she opened her own architectural design firm. She is independent, she is thriving, and she is completely fearless. The frightened woman who packed a worn nylon duffel bag in a downtown Charlotte high-rise simply no longer exists. She knows precisely what she is worth, and she knows she has a family that will go to any length to stand between her and harm. She comes back to visit every month, and the smile she wears now is something I had not seen on her face in years. As for Lenora and me, we are still here in the quiet foothills of western North Carolina. The broken living room window was replaced the very next morning. The perimeter cameras are still running, tucked deep into the hollows of the oak trees, invisible to anyone who doesn't know where to look. Old habits don't let go easily. Some mornings I settle into the weathered wooden porch chair with a hot cup of black coffee and watch the sun come up slow behind the tall pines. I take in the bird song and the wind threading through the branches above me. It is a quiet, peaceful life, and I mean to protect it. I spent 30 years tracking the worst monsters this earth had to offer, and I earned every bit of this retirement. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I want to say thank you. Stories like this one don't get told enough, and you sitting with it means something to me. Looking back on everything Dale and his family endured, the fear Cora carried alone for months, the patience it took to hold still when every instinct screams to act the cost of watching your child suffer before you can show your hand, it reminds me that protection is rarely loud. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is say nothing, wait and prepare. I believe God puts certain people in certain places for reasons we don't always understand until the moment finally arrives. Dale's 30 years of hard work, the skills he never advertised, the life he built quietly in those Carolina foothills, none of it was wasted. It was all in reserve. Here are a few things this story left with me, the kind of father stories that carry real lessons beneath the surface. First, never show your full hand to someone who has already shown you theirs. Let them believe they have the advantage. It costs you nothing, and it costs them everything. Second, dad's revenge, when it comes from a place of protection and not pride, is not cruelty, it is justice. Know the difference and act accordingly. Third, the people who underestimate you are handing you a gift. Accept it quietly. Fourth, if you love someone, build something around them before the danger arrives. A fence is no good after the wolf is already inside. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who protected you without you ever fully knowing it, please share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to His Hidden Revenge, so you never miss what comes next, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grateful, and take good care of the people you love.